All right, we're going to work on modifying the colors in a gradient now. To modify a gradient without filling an object with it, we want to make sure that everything's deselected. And then we're going to double click on the gradient tool. And if you double click on the gradient tool, we'll get into that in just a moment. I did want to show you this because when I double click on that, it only brings up the color picker without showing the gradient slider so that we can change the gradient itself. So for this particular version, the one that I'm working in, the best way to modify it is to double click on this, and then we can change the color stops here. Now to modify an object's gradient, we're going to select the object and open the gradient panel. So since this isn't selected, I can take this now and I'm going to move this over here. And I'm going to bring up the swatches panel. And I'm going to show all swatches, I hope. And then I can add a stop by just clicking here on the gradient. And it's selected. I know it's selected as compared to the other two because it shows this little white mark here. And then I'm just going to click, drag, and drop a color right on top of that. And that adds a color to that particular gradient. Doesn't change the object that I have selected or that I've applied that gradient to because it's not selected. All right, so I'm going to put this back up here. Now we're going to go back and we are going to select the object. Then we're going to bring the gradient out here and we're going to change the gradient. You can change the slider and that will change the either the direction or the angle of the gradient. Or again, as we did, you can just click on click here and add a stop. All right, when you're working with a new gradient, you can just click here to add a stop, but in order to change the gradient that's already applied to an object, we have to double click this. That brings up the color that the stop is, and then options that you can change if you choose to change it. But you see that then does change the object that you have already applied the color to, or the gradient to. Can change the opacity. And then we'll just click here to save that gradient. Now if you actually want to add that gradient to your swatches panel, let's bring up the swatches and hope that will keep the gradient here too. We can click and drag this to the gradient or to the swatches panel, and that will add that gradient to your swatches panel as well. I'm going to try to change this by just clicking and dragging and adding a color to it, which because the item was not selected, it did allow me to change this gradient. But again, if I select this object and try to click and drag, oh, it looks like it will allow me to do it this way as well. All right, and again, if that's a gradient you want to save, you're in the gradient panel. Just click on this gradient and drag it and drop it into your swatches panel to save it. Now it's just as easy to delete an intermediate color. So in order to do that, we click over here and then you can just click and drop that off. Click and drag and drop, and it will be removed from that particular gradient. If you have the item selected, drag and drop, and the result is the same. Now to adjust the location of colors in the gradient, you can adjust the midpoints of the gradient's color stops. At the point at which two color stops are 50%, you just drag a diamond icon above the slider or select the icon and enter a value. So if you want to change that, you can just click and drag that, and you'll see that it changes the midpoint or the location of that particular between those two stops. And to reverse the colors in the gradient, you click Reverse Gradient in the Gradient panel. And there you go. Now to change the opacity of a gradient color, we're going to click a color stop in the gradient panel. And again, our object's selected, so it is going to impact that. We did this just once before. And then we're going to change the opacity by dropping down this arrow to change the opacity. Now you can click the new swatch button also in the swatches panel to save the new or modified gradient as a swatch, or as we have done, you can drag the gradient from the gradient panel or tools panel to the swatches panel. All right, now to apply a gradient across multiple objects, you want to fill all the objects that you have with a gradient. We want to select all of the objects that we want filled, and since I don't have any objects on the all right, we're going to select all. We're going to fill them with a regular color. And then using the gradient tool to do one of the following, we're going to create a gradient with one gradient slider. Click in the artboard where you want the gradients to start and drag where you want them to end. So here's the gradient tool. And I may have to add a gradient to this. I'll do this one. See, I'm clicking and dragging and it's applying the gradient uniformly across all of the objects. And that's to create a gradient with one gradient slider. Click on the artboard where you want the gradient to start and drag to where you want it to end. And let's use a little bit more of a change so you can see. Now that's just with one gradient and all of the objects applied. Now if you want to create a gradient with a gradient slider for every selected object, we're going to click on the artboard where you want the gradient to start, and then Alt if you're on, and drag if you're on a Windows, or Option and drag if you're on a Mac to where you want it to end. I'm going to do this again. And multiple gradient sliders are only created for simple paths. Okay. And you'll see, even though we select a different gradient, the same positioning is still intact for all of the different objects. Now, if we wanted to simply redirect this object or the gradient in this object, just select that object, get the gradient slider tool, and then just click and drag the way that you want to differently direct that with the same gradient, but just directing that particular object on its own.